Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I do very much appreciate you being with me. Hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. Mine was ultra hectic. I got to attend a automotive swap meet, one of the larger ones, and unfortunately, I didn't do very good. I barely sold anything. I barely bought anything. Uh, a few smaller items, that type of thing. Uh, so from a financial perspective, it was a bust. Got to tell you that. But nonetheless, had a really good time and enjoyed taking the break. It was just it was very enjoyable weekend. So anyway, hope you had a fantastic weekend and hope everything was safe and sound and all of that kind of stuff. All right. So what I want to do today, I want to begin a summary of what we have seen in our study of the Olivet Discourse. We've been on this for a good long while. This is video number 809 if my numbering is correct. I sometimes lose track. But nonetheless, we've covered a lot of territory. So let's begin a summary of what we have seen in this series. This will take a little bit of time, but I think it's very important. Let me remind you again that the standard majority view in conservative Christianity, and even among many liberal scholars, is that as Jesus left the temple and the apostles were showing him the beauty, the size, the glory of the temple and the stones of the temple, according to Luke chapter 21, Jesus said, "Do you not see all of these things?" Now, obviously, he's referring to the glory of that temple, the size, the majesty. A little bit of a comment here. I have often said, if I had a time machine and I could go back to any time, I would love to go back to view the temple in, maybe 50 AD. All right? I don't want to go there in 66 AD. No, thank you. But the Herodian construct of the temple was of such magnificent, glorious magnitude that people literally traveled from all over the Roman Empire just to view it. The ancient rabbis said, no man who has never seen the temple in its glory has seen a beautiful thing. Well, okay, they're prejudiced, but that combination of red cedar, white marble, gold, silver, it must have been absolutely awe-inspiring. So little wonder that after Jesus has said in Matthew chapter 23, 37 and following, your house, speaking of that temple, your house is left to you desolate. Now that was undoubtedly stunning to the apostles. It's not to say that they didn't know or did not believe that the temple could not be destroyed. John Calvin said, the apostles simply could not fathom, could not grasp that, that temple could be destroyed unless it was at the end of material creation. Well, I think that's a highly illogical claim, because after all, the apostles were acutely aware there was a Jewish festival, feast day, to celebrate it, or to commemorate it, I should say, not to celebrate it. But they had a feast day and a fast day, 3 of them actually, to commemorate the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Babylonians. So, again, there are 3 different fast days in Israel to commemorate the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, but John Calvin said, which, by the way, the destruction in BC 586 was a horrific, horrific destruction. The temple was destroyed. Now, the Solomonic temple was itself an incredible feat of architecture. So anyway, for John Calvin to say, well, the apostles just simply could not imagine the destruction of the Jerusalem Herodian temple unless it was at the end of time, is a highly, highly illogical argument. So, in response to Jesus' prediction of the coming desolation and destruction of the temple, the apostles asked Jesus, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming, Greek word parousia, and the end of the age? Now, as I said at the very beginning of this study of the Olivet Discourse, I believe that there's not another issue more important than determining what it was that the apostles were actually asking. In my book, Watching for the Parousia, were Jesus' apostles confused? I point out that the vast majority of commentators, even to this very day, I'm glad to say it's changing, but nonetheless, the vast majority of commentators still take the following view. They tell us, well, okay, the apostles are very clearly asking about the impending destruction of the temple because that's what Jesus has just said. Do you not see all of these things? The time is coming in which not one stone shall be left standing on another. They understood that Jesus' prediction of the desolation of that temple included its utter, total destruction. In other words, desolation was destruction, destruction was desolation. So they posed that question. Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your parousia and the end of the age? So again, the great host of commentators say, so here are the disciples asking about the coming destruction of the temple. Now here's something we need to keep in mind. In Mark's account of the Olivet Discourse, Mark chapter 13, in Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse, Luke chapter 21, neither Mark or Luke record a single question about Christ's parousia or the end of the age. By the way, which raises an interesting question, does it not, about the missing hermeneutic, or different word, hermeneutic? I pointed out to you how commentators say, well, this passage over here uses certain words, terms, or phrases. This passage over here doesn't use those same words, terms, or phrases, even though this passage over here was said at the same time and in the same place. Therefore, these must be different. Well, if that's the case, then Matthew must be speaking and recording about a different time and event from that of Mark and Luke. But to be blunt about it, that's a ridiculous argument. But to move on. So the commentators tell us, yes, Jesus foretold the prediction, or foretold the destruction of Jerusalem that everyone knows occurred in AD 70. However, the apostles, as John Calvin stated, associated the fall of Jerusalem with his end of the age coming. Now, of course, they were confused, we are told. They were ignorant, we are told. In another one of my books, I point out how the question of whether or not Jesus was confused is taken for granted among the commentators. Now, when I wrote my book, Watching for the Parousia, where Jesus' apostles confused, Kenneth Gentry, an outspoken critic of covenant eschatology, wrote a series of 4 articles absolutely insisting, adamantly, vehemently demanding, insisting that it's more than obvious that Jesus had to correct the apostles in their blatant misunderstanding. What was Kenneth Gentry's argument to prove that the apostles were confused, that they were ignorant, to conflate the destruction of Jerusalem with his coming in the end of the age? Gentry's entire argument is, well, we know the apostles were confused on other occasions. That must mean they're That must mean they're confused in regard to their questions in Matthew chapter 24. Pardon me. This is, I'm sorry, you'll have to excuse the bluntness. This is horrific. It's one of the silliest and worst logical fallacies that one could imagine. So, what Gentry does, he takes us to Matthew 16 and some other passages, John 14 and et cetera, in which Jesus predicted his impending death, burial, and resurrection. And the text tells us that the apostles were confused. They did not understand what he meant. When Jesus said in John chapter 14, I'm going to go away and prepare a place for you. When I come again, I'll receive you into my own, so that where I am, you may be also. And Thomas, not doubting Thomas, spoke up and said, Lord, where are you going to go? Where are you going to go that we can't go? And Jesus says, Thomas, have I been with you for so long, and yet you still don't understand what I'm talking about? Now, here's something we have to understand. As I pointed out in the earlier videos, as I point out in my book, once again, Watching for the Parousia, where Jesus' apostles confused, I point out that the reason that we know that the apostles were confused on all of these different occasions, and most of those occasions, most of them, are occasions when Jesus was speaking about his coming, death, burial, and resurrection. So how do we know the apostles were confused in those situations? How do we know in John chapter 6, when Jesus said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees? And the apostles are kind of looking at each other. It's humorous. You just think about it. And they're going, do the Pharisees have bread? What's going on here? And Jesus said, look, guys, I'm talking about the doctrine of the Pharisees. Oh. But again, the question is, how do we know that the apostles were confused in these other examples, in these other incidences? One simple reason, ladies and gentlemen, we know the apostles were confused on these other occasions because the biblical text emphatically, explicitly, specifically tells us they did not understand. John chapter 2. Destroy this temple. In 3 days, I will raise it up. Well, the apostles didn't understand what he meant until after his resurrection. Then they understood that he spoke of his resurrection. Hello? Let me reiterate this point, ladies and gentlemen, because this point is so absolutely critical for a proper understanding of the Olivet Discourse. The only reason that we know that Jesus' apostles were confused on other occasions is because the Bible tells us so. Nowhere, listen to me, nowhere in the Olivet Discourse does Jesus ever say, look, guys, you're obviously confused here. You think that my coming in the end of the age is linked to the fall of Jerusalem. Where did you ever get that idea? I'll cover that in the rest of this week as we continue with our summary. The point of fact is, Jesus said not one single word. Matthew, Mark, or Luke ever wrote one single word about the apostles being confused in their linkage between fall of Jerusalem, Jesus is coming, and the end of the age. So, in order to claim that the apostles were confused or that they were ignorant, commentators have to read into the text. This is called exegesis. They have to read into the text the confusion of the apostles on different subjects, on different occasions. And even though on the occasions when the apostles were confused, and the Bible tells us they were confused, or Jesus chided them for their confusion or their ignorance, even though we have not one word in the Olivet Discourse about their confusion or ignorance, we've got to read it into the text. Folks, that is eisegesis. That is not exegesis. And that is a guarantee of a wrong interpretation. Okay, I'm out of time for today. I'll spend the rest of this week through Wednesday summarizing what we have found in regard to the opening issues of the Olivet Discourse. Listen, if we get the apostles' questions wrong, if we fail to understand about the apostles and their understanding of the relationship between destruction of the temple and Christ coming at the end of the age, then we are doomed to misinterpret the Olivet Discourse, which is precisely what the great majority of commentators have done. Okay? I'm out of time. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you on the flip side.